A dying Apache girl crawled to a lone widower's cabin. By dawn, 50 warriors came for her. What she chose next, no one expected. John Bishop stood at the edge of his porch, axe in hand, as the wind shifted against the mountains. At 46, he was a man half carved from wood himself, weathered, hardened, and hollow where it mattered. He rarely stepped into town now. Not since the war, not since Anna died. His boots left no fresh prints except for his own, retraced and worn deeper each day. The only color on his land was the red rust bleeding down the barn roof. He had just raised the axe again when he heard it, soft, broken, like leather tearing under strain. Not an animal, not wind, not the usual loneliness that whistled through the trees like a bad hymn. It came again, low, ragged, human. He dropped the axe without knowing he had and stepped down into the snow. There, near the grove where the pines bent from years of snow weight, something moved. Not a deer, not a fox. A hand, then an elbow, then the whole of her, half covered in frost, crawling, one arm dragging the other, a smear of blood trailing behind her like a dying comet across a white sky. She was young, maybe 19, Apache by her braid and the layered buckskin, though the colors were faded, more earth than war. Blood had darkened the fabric around her shoulder. Her eyes were barely open, but her mouth trembled, lips cracked, whispering something he couldn't yet hear. She collapsed a few feet from his boot. He didn't move, not because he didn't care, but because he was afraid of what would awaken in him if he did. He had heard stories, settlers killed for sheltering their enemy. Apache girls used as spies, old men who made foolish choices and died with knives in their bellies. But none of those thoughts stayed long, because when she looked up at him, half blind, she whispered a single word that didn't belong to his tongue. Nantan. He didn't know the meaning, but the sound of it wrapped around his ribs like an old chord struck true. He picked her up. She weighed almost nothing, less than Anna had at the end. Her hair smelled of pine smoke and sweat. Her body, ice and blood and something else. He carried her across the porch like he was afraid she'd melt. Inside, the cabin was warm but not inviting. A fire crackled in the stone hearth. A kettle simmered faintly. Dust collected in corners where he no longer swept. He laid her on his dead daughter's cot. There was no hesitation now. He pulled the blanket over her, ripped the bloodied leather from her shoulder, boiled rags. He cleaned the wound, wincing each time she flinched in sleep. Her fever made her shiver like a leaf held over flame. She muttered in Apache, soft, sad things that didn't need translating. He didn't sleep that night. Not because of her, but because he was afraid of what she made him remember. The sound of a girl crying softly, a daughter he couldn't save, a wife he buried in silence. He sat near the fire and watched her chest rise and fall. By morning, her skin had color again. Not much, just enough to keep hoping. Her hand twitched once, then stilled, then twitched again. She was dreaming, and in the dream, he hoped she wasn't alone. He stepped outside into the sharp cold, needing the air to bite him back into the man he used to be. His breath fogged in front of him. The sun was trying its best to rise through a ceiling of silver cloud. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried. Then he saw them, not up close, not even at the edge of the trees, but higher, on the ridgeline above the canyon bend, still as ghosts, maybe 6, maybe more, watching. Figures mounted on horses. No movement, no flags, no sound. He didn't raise his rifle, didn't call out. He only turned and went back inside. She woke on the 3rd day, not with panic, not with screams. She opened her eyes like someone used to waking alone and uncertain whether to fight or flee. He was sitting across the room, whittling a piece of pine. They looked at each other. She tried to sit up, winced. He moved to help, and she raised her hand, palm out, trembling but firm. He stopped. She sat up on her own, breathing like it hurt. Then, she bowed her head, not to him, to the cabin, to the room, like a ritual. He set the whittling knife down. "Name?" he asked softly. She stared at him, then looked down. He pointed to himself. "John." She didn't reply, just pointed at her wound, then out the window, then mimed a bow. Arrow. A chase. He nodded slowly. She'd been hunted, wounded, made it here by some kind of miracle. Maybe this cabin was the last place she remembered before the dark took her. Maybe she didn't know why she came. Maybe her feet had chosen it for her. He wanted to ask if she had family, but something in her silence told him not to. That night, he gave her the boiled broth. She drank slowly, hands wrapped around the tin cup like it was holy. Later, by the fire, she took a handful of ash and rubbed it on her palm, then traced a circle on the floorboards. Inside it, a single dot, then two smaller ones beside. He didn't ask. She erased it before bed, but the gesture clung to him. It looked like a mother and two children, or maybe a memory that wouldn't stay buried. The town was 5 miles west, closer to the saloon than Salvation. John hadn't gone in 2 weeks, but the next morning he rode in for supplies. Flour, soap, dried apples. The storekeep squinted. "You got someone with you?" John didn't answer, just paid double and walked out. By the time he reached home, he found a small pile of stones neatly stacked on his porch. 5 flat ones, each marked with a symbol he couldn't read. Warning, message, blessing. He didn't know, but she did, because when she saw them, her face went blank, not frightened, not angry, just still. Then she gathered the stones and placed them in the hearth. Burnt sage that night filled the cabin. She slept curled like a child, but her knife stayed under the pillow, and her dreams grew louder. He heard her cry out once. A name. It wasn't his. It wasn't anyone's. Just a sound like grief. On the 6th day, snow began to fall again. Not heavy, but steady. Fine enough to whisper against the windows. He was cutting wood. She stepped outside. Stood on the porch without a coat, just watching the trees. He handed her his jacket. She didn't take it, but looked at him with something he hadn't seen since before Anna died. Recognition, not of who he was, but of what he carried. They stood there in silence. She reached out, took the jacket, and for a moment, he felt like he'd stepped into someone else's story. One where kindness wasn't dangerous, and mercy didn't need permission. Inside, she gestured to his table, then to the firewood, then to the knife. He handed it to her. She carved for an hour in silence. When she finished, she'd made a small bird, wings out. She handed it to him, and for the first time, smiled. Not wide, not bold, but real. The kind of smile that makes a man wish he'd been kinder sooner. He didn't see them again until that night. Not the girl, not the town, not even the hawk, but the ridge. There were more now. 10, 20, maybe more. No torches, no movement, just watching. She walked to the door, looked at them, and whispered something under her breath. He didn't ask what it meant, didn't need to, because her face said what her mouth didn't. She knew they'd come. She just hoped they wouldn't be so soon. And that's when he understood. She hadn't crawled here to escape them. She crawled here to become someone else before they found her. Someone worthy of saving. Someone not alone. And at that moment, he wasn't either. Even if they both knew. The blood and the snow wasn't hers alone anymore. She did not thank him. Not with words, not with gesture. But every morning, before the sun warmed the frost off the porch steps, she swept them clean. John never asked her to. She simply rose, tied her braid in a loop, and took the broom like it was her own burden to carry. He watched her sometimes from the barn, watched how precise she was, how she always started left to right, careful not to scatter snow into the doorway. Her silence wasn't cold. It was a silence that had been taught by pain. A girl like her had survived something, not by crying louder, but by going still. John brought her new leather for her boots, left it folded on the table with a needle and sinew thread. She said nothing when she saw it, but that night he found her boots mended, stitched with a soldier's patience. She had not asked for mercy. She had only asked to stay warm. She learned fast, faster than he'd expected. Within a week, she was tending the fire on her own, adjusting the draft to keep it from smoking. She cut vegetables without waste, chopped wood without fear. She even patched the hole in the roof, standing balanced on the rafters like she'd lived a life above cliffs and canyons. He called her little flame in his head, because she never raged, never begged, but she burned just enough to warm what had gone cold in him. She didn't speak English, but she was learning. Every evening, she'd point at something sky, bread, hand, and wait for his voice to say the word. Then she'd repeat it softly, carefully. His language felt clumsy on her tongue, but she treated each word like it mattered. And it did, because sometimes he forgot he knew them at all, until she said them back to him. On the 8th night, she placed 3 stones on the windowsill. John found them in the morning, arranged in a line, black, white, and red. He asked what they meant. She said nothing, only tapped her chest, then her mouth, then her feet. Truth, he guessed. She looked away. He didn't ask again, but he didn't move the stones. Word had gotten out. The storekeep's wife saw John buying cloth, and by week's end, whispers were galloping through the town faster than snowmelt in spring. He was keeping an Apache girl, harboring a savage, teaching her to be a woman. Some said he'd lost his mind. Others said he'd lost his faith. Only the preacher came to see him directly. Reverend Gray rode up late one morning with 2 deputies and a prayer book. He stayed on his horse, didn't take off his gloves. "John," he called out, "you know what they say happens when a man lets sin wear a woman's face." John stood on the porch, arms folded. "She's not here to sin. She's not here at all. She doesn't belong. And if her kin find her here, they already have." The preacher blinked. The deputies shifted. "She's being watched," John said. "They're on the ridge, every night. You think they'll let you live? I think they'll let her choose." The preacher muttered something about pride, then blessed the cabin with words John hadn't heard since Anna's funeral. When they left, the snow was deeper, the silence heavier. Inside, she had been watching through the crack in the shutters. She didn't ask who they were. Didn't need to. She picked up the broom and swept the porch again, though the snow had barely settled. That night, she placed another stone on the windowsill. Green. He asked nothing, but something in him felt like it had shifted. Days grew short, nights deeper. She braided his hair once as he dozed by the fire, not for vanity, but because she missed emotion. He let her. He didn't say a word when he found the beads tucked near his collarbone. He showed her how to whittle. She carved a deer, then a bird, then a flame. She left the flame on his pillow. He wanted to ask her name, not the one her people had given, but the one she hadn't spoken since she was chased through the woods with an arrow in her shoulder. But each time he tried, something in his chest caved in, because if she told him, it would mean she decided to stay. And he wasn't sure he deserved that. The first snowstorm came sudden, angry, thick, blind. They barely had enough wood inside. He had to hold the door shut with his full weight while she tied it with rope. For 3 days, the cabin glowed orange and gold. They spoke little, slept warm. On the 4th night, the wind howled through the roof beams like it was morning. She took his hand in the dark and placed it over her heart. Thump, thump, steady, slow. It was the first time he felt her ask for something without speaking. Not for love, not for salvation, just to be known. And he didn't pull away. When the snow cleared, she was gone. Not far, just to the edge of the trees. But her footprints had wandered. He found her crouched beside a log, bare-handed, clutching something small and wet. A rabbit. Dead. Already stiff. She had tears in her eyes. "John," she whispered, voice rough with unused vowels. "John." He knelt beside her, touched her shoulder. She handed him the rabbit, then touched her own stomach. "Hungry?" he asked. She nodded. He nodded back. They buried the rabbit instead of eating it. That evening, she placed a single feather on the windowsill. No stone, just a feather. Long, white, clean. He didn't know what it meant, but it felt like forgiveness. She began to teach him her words. Not many, just one at a time. The word for fire, for pain, for snow, for weight. He repeated them back. She laughed when he got them wrong, a sound soft as cotton. The first time he made her laugh. He didn't move for minutes, just watched her face, lit like spring. There was healing happening. Quietly. Beneath the skin. Beneath the house. Between the spaces where shame used to live. He didn't ask if she would stay. She didn't say she would. But she began to hum at dusk, and hang herbs from the rafters, and tie her hair with a ribbon she found in his wife's old chest. These were not the actions of someone planning to leave. Then came the howl. Not a wolf. Not a coyote. Human. From the ridge. She stood before he did. Opened the door. Stepped barefoot onto the snow. Looked toward the trees. He followed. In the moonlight, the ridge glowed silver. Shadows moved among the pines. One figure raised a hand. Not a threat. Not yet. She didn't move. Just whispered, "Brother." Then turned and walked back inside. Left the door open behind her. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the fire, back straight, eyes fixed. He joined her. "You know them?" he asked. "Yes. They want you back." "No. Then why are they here?" "They want to know who I've become." "And," she looked at him, "I don't know yet." She picked up her knife and began to carve again. Not a bird. Not a deer. This time it was a man. Hair braided. Eyes soft. He watched her whittle the curve of the jaw. The line of the brow. She finished just before dawn. Placed it on the mantel. Then said the first full sentence she ever spoke to him. "You make fire in winter." He didn't know if she meant it as thanks, or warning, or prayer, but it was enough. Because somewhere beyond the ridge, 50 hearts were waiting, and only one would get to decide who she really was. Outside, the frost had begun to melt. A little. Inside, she placed a new stone on the windowsill. Blue. For the sky, he thought. Or for morning. Or for both. The townspeople said her presence had cursed the winter. That the snow lasted longer because of her shadow. That the rabbits had fled. The wolves had drawn near. And even the preacher's horse limped since John let her sleep beneath his roof. No one said it aloud to his face, not yet. But he heard it in the way they spoke his name now, like it was a warning or a curse of its own. He didn't argue. He simply stopped riding into town. Instead, he carved a second chair for the hearth and built a new water barrel beside the door. She boiled snow for laundry and cleaned the cabin top to bottom, humming under her breath in a language she still only half understood. In town, they called her Ghost. At home, she was breath and warmth and movement. She had no name he dared ask. She never offered one. But once, he heard her whisper something to the fire. One word, like a sigh wrapped in smoke. He tried repeating it later when she was outside, but it tasted too holy for his mouth. He started calling her Firebird when he prayed. If his quiet mutterings while shaving counted as prayers anymore. She knew things without being told. That he liked his coffee dark. That the left side of the porch creaked too much in the mornings. That his wife's dress still hung in the wardrobe, untouched, and he didn't want it moved. And he learned things about her without asking. That she braided her hair 3 times each day. That she never let him see her cry. That her back was scarred in places no girl should carry wounds. Sometimes he would catch her staring into the mirror, running her fingers along her jawline, like she didn't recognize it anymore. Like the woman she was becoming wasn't the girl who had crawled through blood and snow to his door. She never asked who he'd buried on this land, but she began lighting a small stick of sage every time she passed the stone near the creek. She never touched it, never prayed aloud, just lit the smoke, let it rise, and kept walking. On the 12th day, someone fired a shot at the cabin. It came from the trees, far enough to miss, but close enough to warn. She dropped the pan she was holding and didn't flinch. John grabbed his rifle and stepped out onto the porch, but found no one. Just a single boot print near the edge of the pines, and a crow feather tucked into the bark of a tree. When he returned, she was kneeling by the fire, her fingers rubbing ash over her palms. He sat beside her and said nothing. She didn't look at him, just murmured a word and pressed the ash to his hands too. After that, she began sleeping with her back to the wall and a knife under her blanket. He rode into town once more, only to speak with the sheriff. Told him about the shot, the feather, the signs. Sheriff Acker leaned back in his chair, chewed on his toothpick like it was a sermon. "You're drawing attention, Bishop." "Not by choice. She's Apache. She's a person." The sheriff shook his head, voice low. "You're not young. You're not fast. If they want her back, if they think you're keeping her against their will." "I'm not." "Then what are you doing?" "I'm giving her a place to stand while she decides who she is." The sheriff stood slowly, placed a hand on John's shoulder. "Just be sure the ground beneath her feet doesn't turn to fire." When he returned, she was gone. The cabin door hung open, a kettle still warm on the stove, her boots missing, her coat folded on the chair. His heart kicked in his chest. Not panic, not yet, but something colder. He followed the snow-crushed prints down the trail, past the creek, into the trees. Her path was deliberate, straight, no stumble, no turn. He found her beneath the hanging cedar, standing, not running, facing west. The wind stirred her braid. Her hands were clenched. He called her name, not that he knew it, but the one he'd whispered under breath, Firebird. She turned, eyes rimmed red but dry. Her voice was calm. "They say I bring death. You don't. They say I burn my own blood. You didn't. They say I belong to them." He didn't answer, because he knew what she meant, and she wasn't wrong. She took a step toward him, her bare feet pressed into the snow like it owed her something. She reached out and placed her hand against his chest. "I want to stay," she whispered, "but not as a ghost." "You're not." "I want to live." "You are." She nodded once, then leaned her forehead against his shoulder. Not like a lover, not like a daughter, but like a soul deciding which body to trust. He placed his arm around her gently, the way one holds a flame in wind. That night, they returned to the cabin together. He didn't ask where she had gone. She didn't explain. But something in the way she poured water into the kettle said she'd left behind a version of herself in those woods. She carved 2 small wooden figures after that, one with braids, one with short hair. She gave the short-haired one to him, tucked the other under her pillow. John stared at his in the firelight, wondering if she saw him as protector, or kin, or just a man who had built a fence she didn't yet know she could leave. He almost asked her once, what would happen if they come? But he stopped, because he already knew. They would come, not to take her, but to test her, to see if the girl who'd fled was still the one who feared them. The next Sunday, the preacher came again, alone this time. She was weaving thread by the fire, didn't rise, didn't hide. The preacher removed his hat at the door. His voice was soft. "Child, you carry smoke around you." She looked up. "Yes, you know smoke can cloud judgment. Only for those who don't breathe it often." John sat beside her, silent. The preacher looked between them. "I came to pray." She stood, bowed her head, then pray. And so he did. For peace, for mercy, for protection, but mostly for understanding. When he left, he placed his hat to his chest and said, "She's stronger than most men I've buried." John nodded. "I know." That night, she placed another stone on the windowsill. It was obsidian, black and heavy. He picked it up. "You keep marking time," he said. "I keep choosing." "Choosing what?" She didn't answer, but in the morning, the fire burned longer than usual, and the snow melted from the porch before the sun touched it. At dusk, she wore a shawl she'd sewn herself, blue thread, trimmed with a pattern he didn't recognize. He watched her comb her hair in the reflection of the cabin window, watched the way she tilted her head, not in pride, not in vanity, but like she was checking if she still looked like the girl they'd left behind. He didn't say a word, because she already knew the answer. The next dawn, she stood outside, watching the eastern ridge. "They're close," she whispered. He followed her gaze. 4 horses, maybe 5, silhouettes in the mist. Not charging, not hiding, waiting. She placed a bundle on the steps, a knife, a feather, and the wooden figure she'd carved of herself. He stepped forward. "What's that for?" "It's what I don't need anymore." Then she turned to him, her voice a quiet ache. Will you still know me when I choose to stop hiding? He didn't speak. He stepped forward and pulled her into his arms, not tight, not heavy. Just enough for her to know. Yes. And when the wind stirred the ridge and the shapes began to move, neither of them stepped back. At first, it was the stillness that woke him. Not the howl of wolves, not the thud of hooves, but the kind of stillness that comes before a storm, the kind that sucks the breath from the pines and hushes even the wind. John sat up in the dark, hand instinctively reaching for the rifle beside the door. The fire had gone out. The coals whispered only the faintest red. She was already awake, standing at the window. She didn't speak when he approached, just turned her head slightly, enough to show she was listening to something only she could hear. The land was holding its breath. "They've come," she said softly, not in fear, not even in sorrow, just certainty. He moved to her side. In the distance, barely visible beyond the frost-touched trees, the shape of riders emerged, slow-moving, many, at least 50. Their silhouettes painted the ridge with solemn grace, neither charging nor stalling. They came as the sun began to rise, cold blue light creeping over the hills like a second kind of silence. She stepped back from the window. Her face did not change, not in defiance, not in grief, but in readiness. She tied her braid, folded the shawl she'd woven, slipped her knife into her boot, and walked to the hearth, where she removed the final stone she had left on the mantel, white, smoothed by fire. John stood in the doorway, unsure if he was meant to stop her. He didn't. Instead, he said, "I'll come with you." She turned, and for a moment, he saw the girl she used to be, tired, bloodied, crawling through snow. "No," she replied. "They won't speak if you do. But if they try, they won't." "Why are you so sure?" She gave a small smile, soft as a breath in frost. "Because I'm not the same girl they left behind." Then she kissed his hand, not his cheek, not his lips, just his hand, the one that had carried her, carved wood with her, boiled broth when she couldn't speak. And then she stepped out into the cold. The porch boards creaked. The snow gave under her weight. Her shawl flared like a flag in the wind. Her bare hands trembled, but she didn't hide them. The warriors were already there. A semicircle of motionless riders, mounted and regal beneath the naked trees, bows across their backs, eyes like winter itself, sharp, ancient, unyielding. In the center sat a man with braids thick as rope and a scar down one side of his face. Her brother. John had never seen him before, but he knew instantly. The way her shoulders lifted, the way her eyes did not drop. There was history between them, words never said and wounds never stitched. She stopped 10 paces from them, alone. Her breath ghosted into the sky. Her brother dismounted, took slow, heavy steps toward her. When he stopped, only a single arm's length remained between them. "You chose death," he said in their tongue. She replied in the same. "I chose truth." "You shamed the blood. I didn't light the fire. I just walked through it. You bled for outsiders. I bled for myself." His voice hardened. "You lived with him." She didn't flinch. "I lived. You carry his smell. I carry my name. You buried it. I dug it back up." He reached to grab her arm, but she moved back a single step, then knelt. She removed the knife from her boot, the feather from her braid, and the wooden figure of herself from her pocket. She placed them on the ground between them. "I return what I don't need." Then she stood, her spine unbending. "If you kill me, make it clean, but don't call it justice." A murmur passed among the riders. Her brother stared at her, eyes wild with restraint. Then he shouted, at no one and everyone, words John couldn't understand. 3 elders dismounted. 1 woman, 2 men. They walked forward and circled her, slow, deliberate, like priests around a fire. The woman asked a single question. "What name do you speak for yourself now?" She didn't answer right away. Then she turned to the cabin, where John watched from the doorway. She pointed. "The one who gave me warmth calls me Firebird." The elders said nothing, but they nodded. Her brother's face twisted, rage and love breaking in the same blink. "You are not dead to us," he said, voice gravel. She didn't reply. He looked at the figure she'd carved, at the blade, at the feather. Then, slowly, he picked up the wooden carving and placed it in his saddlebag. "She can stay," said the elder woman, "but no one will come again." "She was never meant to be followed," her brother said. And with that, the riders turned. They mounted in silence. No cheers, no shouts, just the sound of hooves pressing snow and history into the earth. She watched until the last silhouette vanished behind the trees. Only then did she breathe. Her knees gave slightly, but she caught herself. She didn't fall. She turned. John stood where she'd left him, hands clenched, breath frozen in his throat. She walked back slowly, her boots crunching the frost, the wind playing with the fringe of her shawl. At the edge of the porch, she paused. She looked up at him, not for approval, not for invitation, just to make sure he saw her. All of her. He stepped aside, held the door open. She crossed the threshold like someone returning from war, shoulders hunched with invisible metals. Inside, the fire still waited, the coals still warm. She sat beside it, removed her boots, removed her shawl, and only then did she cry. Not loud, not broken, just a single sob. John knelt beside her. He didn't say, "You're safe." He didn't say, "They're gone." He simply placed the white stone she'd taken from the mantel into her hand. She looked at it for a long moment, then placed it back on the windowsill. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds. The frost on the porch began to melt. Inside, the cabin breathed again. And though she did not look back at the ridge, he knew. Neither of them would ever be the same.